right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Risk and Resilience Symposium session on Great Power Competition. The session is titled Spheres of Influence, China, Russia, and the United States. I'm Marco Barazio. I'm a sophomore at Tufts, and I'll be leading this conversation. Over the past decade, relations among the world's major powers have shifted from episodic rivalry to sustained strategic competition. The United States, China, and Russia now interact across multiple domains simultaneously: security, trade, technology, energy, finance, and diplomacy, often in ways which blur the line between economic policy and geopolitical strategy. What makes this triangular relationship particularly complex is that it's not just driven solely by ideology or military power, but it's shaped much more by market pressures, sanctions regimes, financial signaling, domestic political constraints, and their perception of risk. Strategic decisions made in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington increasingly reverberate through the globe, its alliances and institutions in real time. At the same time, the growing alignment between Russia and China has raised fundamental questions. Is this partnership durable or contingent? Is it driven by shared interests, shared grievances, or shared opposition to the United States? And how much agency do markets, economic constraints, and global financial systems really have in shaping state behavior? This session brings together three experts with distinct but complementary perspectives from global markets, Russian foreign policy, and international diplomacy to explore how this triangular relationship operates today and where its limits may lie. With that, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. First off, Sassan Ghahramani is the president and CEO of SGH Macro Advisors LLC, a global macro and geopolitical firm that produces forward-looking analysis on major central banks and key policy developments shaping global interest rates, equity, and currency markets. SGH's proprietary research is used widely by leading hedge funds, asset managers, and financial policy officials around the world. Mr. Ghahramani founded SGH Macro Advisors in 2009, taking the firm independent in 2012, and today oversees all of its research, personally producing analysis on the European Central Bank, Europe, China, US policies, and geopolitics. Prior to forming SGH, he served as president and CEO of Medley Global Advisors and spent over a decade as the senior foreign exchange trader at firms including UBS, Lehman Brothers, AIG Trading, and Chemical Bank. His career bridges global markets, policy analysis, and geopolitics. Mikhail Troitsky is a visiting professor and administrator of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Chengdu University. He was a visiting scholar at the Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Affairs in 2008 to 2025, and professor of practice in Russian studies at the University of Madison, Wisconsin from 2023 to 2024. From 2003 to 2002, he held academic and philanthropic roles in Russia, including serving as the dean and associate professor at MGIMO University and as deputy director and program officer at the MacArthur Foundation's Moscow office. His work focuses on Russian foreign policy, Eurasian politics, conflict resolution, and international security. He's published in Post-Soviet Affairs, Why Climate Change, Problems of Post-Communism, Survival, Global Policy, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and has contributed commentary to Newsweek, International New York Times, Fox Now, CNN, NPR, Boston 7 News, the BBC, ABC Australia, the Moscow Times, and other outlets. Ambassador Jorge Heine is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and former Chilean ambassador to China, India, South Africa. He's served as a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University from 2019 to 2025, and his most recent book is The Non-Aligned World. His career spans diplomacy, academia, and policy engagement across the global south. To frame this discussion, we'll focus on a few broad themes this afternoon. Firstly, the nature and limits of the China-Russian relationship, how the U.S. policy shapes that relationship rather than simply reacting to it, how these dynamics have evolved over the past 3 decades, and particularly within the last 10 years, the role of diplomacy, multilateral institutions, and middle powers in managing great power rivalry, and how markets interpret and price geopolitical risk differently than policymakers might. Finally, we'll close by asking what assumptions about great power competition today are most likely to prove wrong in the coming decade. We'll begin with a few broad framing questions, and then we'll continue with an audience Q&A. All right, so this is the first question, and all three of you guys can take it, or whoever wants it first. It is, how real is the China-Russia alignment, and what are its limits?
Okay, I can go first. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation. And great to be here. Um, yeah, so conventional wisdom now is that Russia, China, or sign the Russian partnership or alliance is a marriage of convenience or a nexus of convenience or something that is pretty kind of temporary and circumstantial. And the books are being written uh, making this argument very cogently. I recommend the recent paper, a long one, 60 pages, by what is known as the New Eurasian Strategies Center, or NES Center, profound study of Sino-Russian relations, also including that it's just tactical, circumstantial. There's little love lost, and that it can fall apart under manifold pressures. Now, and I'll make just one quick point. And these arguments are all grounded in reality and well looking at closely. I would only say the interpretation of Sino-Russian alliance as an axis of convenience only kind of applies to the mainstream scenario, which has the probability of 50, 60 percent of China and Russia remaining more or less where they are now in terms of their geopolitical positioning, their political regimes, or behavior abroad, and so forth. So, all things being equal and same as they are today, yeah, you can interpret Sino-Russian relations as this marriage of convenience whenever there's a need. Trade and political interactions intensify, and there's a promise of a full-fledged alliance. But then something changes, and China and Russia become these kind of cautious neighbors, and they are not friends at heart. So to say. But my quick point is that there are scenarios on sort of both sides of the spectrum where things start playing out different for Russia and China. So one scenario I think is right now in the making, if you are following U.S. Russia interactions around the Ukraine war, and if you read about and now these are serious publications such as The Economist writing about Russia's outreach to the United States with you know with large scale with offers for large scale business ventures and collaborations. So if you look at that, uh, you can be sure China is freaking out. This is the main sort of source of concern for China. Will Russia, can Russia betray us? And they believe Russia will eventually betray China because Russia is mostly interested in relations with the West, and whenever a window of opportunity opens, Russia kind of gravitates towards the West, towards the United States. So what China is going to do now in relation with, and there are other concerns on the Chinese side as well, like what Russia did in Venezuela. Is Russia, has Russia helped, Maduro well enough, or Russia just backed down, made a deal with the United States? The same applies with Iran, right? To Iran right now. So China is very upset with what Russia is doing, and that can, boil the waters pretty much. Mainly for Russia, if China, starts playing hardball, then we go, out of this domain of marriage of convenience, and China really becomes very upset with Russia, and there are implications that we can discuss further. And then on the other sort of end of the spectrum is truly, China goes all in, supporting Russia's war against, whoever, Ukraine, maybe Europe, who knows? Because China believes it's to China's benefit to divert attention, Western attention from Russia, from whatever else is happening in China, U.S. relations, for example. And then we can see, a much closer alliance between China and Russia. And so my final kind of sentence here is that there's still constituencies in Russia for sure, and likely also in China that want to go beyond this axis of convenience, right? And although current developments probably make China very cautious, at least, and maybe even opposed and angry at Russia, there's a scenario where Russia and China come together, and China starts funding Russian messaging to push down the show. So marriage of convenience in between with two fringe scenarios, each of which has like 20% becoming 20% from becoming reality. That's going to be my
And I have a couple follow-ups if anyone else, Sassan or Jorge wants to take any.
Sure, if you don't mind, maybe I like that. Thank you, Marco, by the way, for the introduction and the very interesting comments that you made. Just as by way of background, as you said, I'm in the financial markets, but I grew up. My father was a diplomat under the Shah of Iran when Iran was very pro-United States, 1969, 1974. So I actually he was posted in Moscow in the then Soviet Union at the time during sort of the height of the Cold War. I look at things through the lens of the financial markets. And I would say I would maybe press the marriage of convenience a little bit harder than a marriage of convenience. I think it really, from Russia's perspective, is a marriage of necessity. And there's no question that this is a very, very unequal relationship. It has developed into a very unequal relationship with China as the dominant partner, and Russia as they call this a very special relationship, and I think there's no question about it. There's a very special relationship in sort of this alliance against the United States, in and to some extent the European Union, although China in particular has always tried to play off the EU and have them play a role of an intermediary, or not intermediary, as a sort of a buffer basically between the U.S. and China. So coming at it from the perspective of economics in some extent and financial power and financial clout. Well, just sorry. Before that, and just as a small anecdote, like we when we talk to officials in China, we get just as an anecdotal, for example, recently in the run up to there was a summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump planned for April, but the basically before and after sort of every interaction that happens between Russia and the United States, Russia, I don't want to, I hate to use these terms, but reports to China on the situation, and they need China to back them right now. Now, I don't think, and I hope that this isn't how it always has to be, because I agree with, sorry, I forget that your panelist next to you, that ultimately I can see a path. We see Russia as the European Union in particular sees Russia as the enemy right now. Maybe, and I would hope that there was a path for Russia to. There was a time when there was regular commercial transactions between Russia and the European Union and the West, and this of course was all upended under after the situation in Ukraine. Now, I'm a capitalist at heart, but I want to start with a quote from Karl Marx, which maybe a lot of you have heard. It's a little bit of old hat, but the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And so I'll just maybe share a few data points with you. And we're talking about sort of the trend in the last 30 years and the balance of powers and what has happened and what has shifted in the balance of powers. And if you look at it from the situation, of economic power, along with military, obviously, but economic power is might. If you look at what's happened with the U.S. GDP uh, from 2000 to 2024 went from 10 to 29 trillion dollars. And I'm going to include the European Union here because I know this isn't the subject, but I see this really as more tri-party, where obviously the EU is closer to the US. But this is I think really the way that the power structures are being set up right now. The European Union went from roughly 7 trillion to 19 trillion. Uh, um, the US 10 to 30, 29. China went from 1.2 to 19, and Russia went from 0.2 to 2. Okay, so there's a $2 trillion economy versus the U.S. at almost 30, the European Union and China. Essentially, if you looked at them as the three regional economic centers at about 19 each. Um, and I think one of the beneath the GDP growth from 0.2 to 2, there is an even more problematic statistic, so to speak, for Russia, which is that over the last 10 years or so, I think what is it, 2014 to 2024, it has been stuck at 2. And we can discuss this, but as far as the reasons and the root causes for this and all of that. But from the economic perspective and from the financial market community, Russia, it is a military power, clearly with its nuclear capabilities. There are some questions now over it's being bogged down on the conventional weapon side with Ukraine and what that actually means. But obviously, it still has military clout. It's still clearly an important country, but as far as its role and influence for on global economy, and you can see this in the financial markets, is almost directly related to its significance as an oil producer, right? And so this is its main economic cloud. But even here, the share of Russia's global oil production in 2000 was 11%. In 2024, it's 11%. The U.S. has gone from, oh gosh, 9% to 20% of share of global oil production. So on a relative basis, it's an owner of significant natural resources, predominantly oil. This is clearly important. This is something that China, that the world needs and wants. But even there, I think its clout has diminished significantly over time. I'll conclude just with an anecdote. Back in 2016, I had a small dinner with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. at the time, Sergei Kislyak. Interestingly, ethnically Ukrainian. He told me that maybe Jorge knows from his foreign service days. And Kislyak said something to me that this was in 2016 that really stuck in my head. And he said, I am really worried about the trajectory of U.S. Russia relationship because as much as there is tension and geopolitical tension between U.S. and Russia and U.S. and China, but there is very little economic necessity from the U.S. side. The economic links, the commercial links are very marginal for the U.S. economy beyond sort of the price of oil, whereas China has touted this and built on this, in a quite rapid way, as overtook Japan as a second largest global economy, and so there is a need for the U.S. to play with China, whereas there is far less need for them to play with Russia. So I'll leave it here. I can go on and leave some time for the other panelists and some follow-up questions, Marco. Thank you.
Jorge, if you have anything to add, or I can move on to the next question.
Yes, of course. So, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Marco. It's really a privilege to speak at the Tufts University event. Until a few months ago, I was just across the river at the U. I'm now based in Santiago, and it's good to be back in Boston, if only virtually. So, Sassan quoted Marx. Let me quote Lenin. Lenin said very apocryphally that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I would posit to you that this is exactly what we will see in the course of 2026. On January 3rd, we have, of course, the attack on Venezuela, on Caracas, and the kidnapping of President Maduro. We have had the claims of the United States on Greenland. There is a possibility, we don't know, something might happen in Iran. So we're living in turbulent times. Now, that said, I would posit to you that in these very turbulent times, at the very core of this turbulence is the contest between the superpower competition, between great power competition between China and the United States. Now, this panel is on the triangular relationship between the United States, China, and Russia, and obviously Russia, in partnership with China, plays an important role in this contest that we are witnessing. Now, it's important, it seems to me, to put this in perspective, and I would like to take a step back and get away sort of from the day-to-day and put this in some historical perspective, and to get a sense of how we got to this place where we are now. In this triangular relationship, we have the United States on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other. Now, what I find fascinating is that some 55 years ago, we had 53 years ago, 54 years ago, we had one of the most extraordinary diplomatic initiatives of the 20th century, in which President Nixon, hand in hand with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, visited Beijing, making a very impromptu visit that broke all established rules. And what they did in a diplomatic masterstroke positioned the United States between what then, the Soviet Union then, and China and the PRC, essentially putting the United States in a better position, both with Beijing and with Moscow, than Beijing had with Moscow or vice versa. This was an extraordinary diplomatic initiative that for some, 20-some years put the United States in a very favorable position in this geopolitical competition at the very height of the Cold War. Now here we are in 2026, and we see that this, of course, has been reversed. Today, we have the United States on the one hand, and we have China and Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, on the other hand. So the first question I would like to put to the audience is, what led to this extraordinary change? How did the United States manage to fumble the extraordinary advantage it had, thanks to President Nixon and Henry Kissinger's initiative that put itself at a great advantage between the Soviet Union and China, to today's position, in which, I think the numbers vary, but some people say that President Xi and President Putin has met something like 50 times, 55 times since they are both presidents. President Xi calls President Putin his best friend, which may or may not be true, but the fact that he says it tells you something. That we had this remarkable meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in last year, in which we had the spectacle of Prime Minister Modi walking hand in hand with President Putin towards President Xi to proclaim their unending friendship. what has happened? What did US diplomacy do to manage to undo President Nixon's remarkable initiative? So I would posit to you that what we are seeing is not a marriage of convenience between China and Russia. I think we're seeing what I would call an entente cordiale between two countries that have decided to work together to recreate Eurasia, that concept that essentially vanished from the 20th century but has now been resurrected, to work together on things, for example, like the Belt and Road Initiative, which one could think would be something that Russia would be adamantly opposed and see it as something that would impinge in Central Asia on, former Soviet republics, the CIS, but somehow they managed to work together. So I would put to you that what we have is not a marriage of convenience. I would describe it as an entente cordiale, which is working together on many fronts. We see it in the BRICS, we see it in the SCO, and obviously there's been a change. This is not easy. It used to be, of course, that the Soviet Union was the big brother and China was the little brother. Today, that relationship has switched. Today, China is the big brother and Russia is the small brother. Obviously, that creates difficulties and all sorts of problems. And obviously, there are issues that make this relationship a complex one. The most important one, of course, is that Siberia is a largely uninhabited territory, and China is recently the most populous country in the world, and the pressures thus to move towards these largely uninhabited lands is very much there, and there's of course there are historical reasons for it. But I would say that what we have seen is that both the United States and Europe have done the utmost, basically push Russia towards its eastern an eastern destiny, an eastern choice, if you will, away from Europe, and there the association with China has been extremely significant. Thank you.
All right, if anyone has any replies to that, or I can go on to the next question. All right.
Yeah, if I could, I agree with the master's comments that this is far stronger than a marriage of convenience, however you want to label it. I would dispute, again, I look at this through economic lens in a large way, the notion that this is really sort of the U.S. has made some mistakes that have created this environment clearly. And I would focus again, looking at power and money and economics being power. I would focus on a couple of really important milestones here, and one is the accession of China to the WTO. And this was quite a popular thing, at the time. Clinton tried to shepherd this through, and China as a sort of a massive market. And there's an enormous rethink of this now that it essentially that the Chinese, and I'm not faulting them for this, this was the right thing from their self, interest, but it gave them quite a strong advantage on their terms of trade and in building their economic clout. The other is the 2012 accession of Xi Jinping, who had the very stated goal of focusing on rivaling the U.S. on both the economic front and the military front and the economic front, as well. And I don't think we've seen, unfortunately for Russia, and again going back to the comment that Kizak made to me, I don't. As far as the market size and all of that, I don't think that Russia, had the means or the wherewithal to really, keep up with that. So, and so this is the backlash. So now we have to look forward, right? And so this is a backlash that we are seeing now from the U.S. You're seeing it in the Trump presidency, and he's one of his main focuses has been China bashing, although he's more sympathetic to Russia, as we know. is really on the grounds of if you look at real per capita, China has China has gone from what, like $970, I think, real per capita to $13,000, whereas Russia stayed 5,400 to 11,000. So it's a marriage of it's a marriage of necessity, but I also think that again the shift in the balance has been huge between Russia and China, and these are maybe some of the reasons that I don't think Russia particularly likes that China is making inroads into Kazakhstan and into Central Asia through the SCO and the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's the fact that they need China, and there's not that much that they can do about it.
Yes, Marco, can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So, Senator John McCain described Russia as nothing but a petrol station masquerading as a country. I would argue that it's one of the most mistaken views that has been voiced about Russia. The fact that we are talking today about the triangular relationship between the United States, China, and Russia tells you that it's not a petrol station. This is a former superpower. It may be, economically much smaller than other countries, but it is a nuclear power, it is a space power, and it has the diplomacy and the background of a former superpower. You ignore that at your peril to say, as some people do, well, the Russian economy is the size of Italy. Who cares? Well, that is the wrong approach. Nobody would say that the Prime Minister of Italy is as influential as the President of Russia. So it seems to me it's not all just about GDP. It's also about how to manage diplomacy, how to manage foreign policy. And in that regard, I would put to you that Russia is a country that you should really consider in today's world politics.
All right. The next question is, how have relationships among the United States, China, and Russia evolved over the past 3 decades, and how have those dynamics more strongly shifted in the last 10 years? It's very broad, so definitely think of however you like.
Yeah, because we've covered much of that already, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, China over those 3 decades that you just mentioned has been growing its economy, trying to tap faster, in particular U.S. technology, know-how, capital, and also supplying cheap consumer goods to the United States that while exercising caution on DRC's claims vis-a-vis Taiwan, and so that created a kind of stability based on economic interdependency and mutual restraint between the United States and China. And China has for decades cherished this sort of Deng's principles treading very carefully, especially in relation with other great powers, while Russia has been more revisionist at heart. And some decade and a half ago, apparently Russia decided to play hardball and just openly declared its intention to thwart the existing order, at least in Europe, but in reality much broader. And China was reaching out to, and Russia was reaching out to China as early as 2008, kind of trying to conspire to thwart the U.S. dollar amidst the initial stages of the U.S. Of the global economic crisis and U.S. subprime crisis. And at that point, China demurred and said it's no way in China's interest to thwart U.S. economy and just pit China against the United States. But Russia has been Russia's revisionism has been on the rise ever since, and at some point, China decided that Russia as a ram in China's rear, dependent on China, as the other speakers very clearly articulated, and at the same time fiercely opposed to the West, is a useful instrument. Again, if China can, if not control, but kind of steer Russia by a variety of means, including financial and political influence and ideological affinity and regime similarity and so forth. So for China, Russia's role as a ram against the Western-led order was very useful, but that only applied to the situation when Russia was still not openly, militarist and revisionist. And as soon as Russia, kind of, came out and started a full-fledged war in Europe, I think China has been facing serious dilemmas in its sort of triangular relationship or its relations with the United States and Russia. Again, in a nutshell, the point is that again, China wants some degree of tension in Russia's relations with the West to keep Russia at bay and on a short leash. But when push comes to shove, when Russia starts contemplating or even threatening nuclear strikes in Ukraine, for example, China gets very uneasy. And that's one kind of dilemma. And the other dilemma is whether if there's a deal to be made between Russia and the United States, what does China do? Does it go all in, supporting Russia's war effort, bankrolling it, which will have a tremendous cost in relations with Europe and the United States as well, or should China try to rein Russia in and sort of nudge it towards a deal on Ukraine? And so China is now on the fence as to whether tell Moscow to call it a day, and then Moscow is not likely to comply actually, but or whether China should again go all in and support and lend full support to Moscow, which will result in a major conflagration with the United States, where President Trump badly wants peace between Russia and Ukraine. So again, when Russia is moderately opposed to the West and kind of trying to undermine the order by surreptitious means here and there, testing its strength, it's very good for China. But when Russia chooses an all-out war against the order, China is faced with difficult dilemmas, and those dilemmas are being solved by the Chinese leadership.
Marco, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So it seems to me it is important to put this triangular relationship, significant as it is, against the broader canvas of what we are seeing as the wealth shift, as the World Bank has called it, from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. What we've seen in the course of the new century is a major change as to where wealth is being created in the world. It used to be said that the 19th century was the British century, the 20th century was the US century, the American century. A lot of people say that this already is, and certainly will be, the Asian century. And in that role, China, of course, plays a key place. So does India, so do the countries of ASEAN. And that, it seems to me, is a critical point. We are way past the era when the West, including the United States, used to dictate the terms of what would happen in world politics. Today, we have a very different relationship in which, it's not just the geopolitics, but also the geoeconomics, in which countries in Asia are occupying a central role in world politics. And this also goes hand in hand with the role of the global south. And this, it seems to me, is extremely important. The main cleavage in world politics for much of the 20th century was framed one might say, in sort of short terms, as it was defined after the 1945 end of World War II. The narrative was basically, the democratic West against the authoritarian East, and that was what framed much of the discussion, much of the narrative in world politics. What we are seeing today is something very different. We're seeing this after the war in Ukraine, but I would argue particularly after the war in Gaza, which the narrative now is not that short-term post-45 narrative. Nowadays is very much the global South, the colonial nations that shed their colonial ties against the old imperial powers. The Western imperial powers that dominated world politics for 5 centuries. And then it seems to me this is what we're seeing in Africa, what we're seeing in Latin America, what we're seeing in Asia. That is a very different dynamic. And in that dynamic, Russia and China are no longer the villains. This is not how South Africa, India, Brazil, Mexico look at world affairs. The West plays a much more diminished role in that view. And it seems to me that in that regard, this realignment that we're seeing in world politics with the rise of the BRICS that I mentioned earlier, which was for long dismissed as basically a talking shop that didn't have any significance really in world affairs. But that today, with 10 members, the most recent one being Indonesia, close to half of the world's population, close to half of the world's oil production, with its own bank, the BRICS Bank, with the SEO that I mentioned earlier is coming up as well. It's a very different dynamic. And it seems to me that unless we put this triangular relationship, the US, Russia, and China, in this broader context in which Russia and China are no longer the villains, but are seen by many countries in the global South as partners, we will miss what is really happening. Thank you.
Sassan, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think clearly the U.S. has over this has lost influence in Africa, for example, in the global South, as you mentioned. I mean, this has been a trend that China has made, and in Latin America has made great inroads, and and we've seen that. We can go through individual countries, commercial ties, and all of that. I think that's undisputable. I think we have to look at where it goes from here, and I do think that yes, the Trump administration is to some extent transactional, and we know that, but there is an effort to reestablish, and by the way, I would very much argue against the terminology of saying that the U.S. is imperialist and China's not. That this is some sort of benign relationship, but China is raping Africa with its natural resources. Maybe the governments and the corrupt powers there are fine with that, but you look at what's happened in Africa, it's hard to say that there's been any advancement at all, unfortunately, in that continent. So China is as much of a rapist of an imperial power as the European powers were, and it's time the United States has not been a great actor in this. We have to be realistic about that. And so now I think the Trump administration is making attempts to roll that back. You look at the sort of what they're doing in Latin America, the reestablishment, and it's the Don, or whatever Trump calls it, the Monroe Doctrine, sphere of influence. They just pushed China and Russia severely out of Venezuela, and I think that in the Middle East, you did not mention the Middle East. The Middle East, the Saudis in particular, between Russia, Saudi, and China, their relationships have clearly improved. The Saudis have over the years looked east, looked to Asia. I'm not at all disputing that the rise of economic power, but I think if we look at this going forward, there is a policy to try to reverse that, and then maybe, if you want to put it in simple terms, to try to reestablish U.S. power and whatever you might want to call it, economic power, imperial power, whatever. It's just, to me, it's just nomenclature. We'll see how successful that is. There are, major forces. China has an incentive, for all of this. Yeah, that China has the big rivalry, but Russia is in an unfortunate position where it runs the risk of being the sacrificial lamb at some point, between China and the U.S. And you see this in sort of the relationship between Xi Jinping and Trump, and you have the summit, and nobody wants to rock the boat. And frankly, China's this ascent and this dominance of the economy, it's real, it's clear, it's there. But you look at Japan, Philippines, Singapore, the U.S. doesn't make and the rise of Takeuchi in Japan was a strong ally of the United States. Malay in Argentina, there is a counter trend that is going on. I don't know how durable that ends up being. We shall see. But I just wanted to add that, maybe a little bit of pushback to what you were saying there, Jorge. I'm not disputing the overall narrative, but I think where we are now is an interesting juncture.
All right, I'm gonna open it up to audience questions, if that's okay with you guys.
Of course.
Yeah, I'll go.
Hi, is it on? Hi, I'm Tony Sun. I'm the admin dean at Each College. Um, I agree with the panelists that the Russian China relationship is not out of needs, but necessity. So my question is, the current Trump administration's policy towards China, it's supposed to deter China from this kind of influence that is getting around the globe, but the effect is actually the opposite. Uh, the policy is actually pushing other Western nations towards China. So as we saw from the latest example of Canada, resuming the diplomatic relationship with China. So, is there any way within the Trump administration that this policy will shift? Like, is there anyone in his administration that can see that this kind of policy is not effective?
Maybe if I can take that quickly, if you guys don't mind. Look, I think when it comes to Canada in particular and the USMCA and the North America, relationships, you talk about the Trump administration, but I would take a step back and look at Congress as well and the Republican caucus, and there is a great degree of unease with how aggressively Trump has gone after Canada on economic issues and quite a few other issues. So we just had a vote in Congress that passed, and this is a Republican Congress, and it passed with significant amount of Republican votes. There was essentially a slap on the wrist on Trump and on Canada in particular, and on the sort of the aggressive posture that we've had on tariffs, and frankly the executives authority to do that. Now, the administration, this is one that has really pressed its executive power, and so it's fine. Congress can complain, but they'll sort of keep doing it as long as until something fully stops it. But I do think that this pushback is real. I think that Trump, especially when it comes from Republicans, that this was a little bit of a wake up call. We have at the same time the ruling in the Supreme Court the executive on Trump's and the president's authority to use tariffs, i.e. the IEPA authority. I don't know how closely you guys follow this IEPA authority to use tariffs as leverage for foreign policy objectives and all that. That's going to be coming out soon. This will be very interesting. If I'm interested in these kinds of things, I would watch that. We really don't know which way that ruling is going to go, but there's the general sense is that they're kind of going to split the baby in the middle and maybe put some limitations, but not all. Of course, the administration has other authorities that they can use to wield the economic weapon that they have, which they have been using, against Canada, against other countries, Section 232, 301, all that, and on lumber and all that. But ultimately, self interest is sort of your guardrail on that. And so we have the Trump administration has been backing off quietly and a little bit on steel tariffs, on aluminum tariffs. They're concerned about inflation back home. And so it's not that, they're suddenly being like nice guys and deciding that we want to, pay touchy-feely with the rest of the world, but it's like it's starting to affect them. It's starting to affect Trump domestically. It's affecting him in the polls. He was ranking high in the economy, and that has gone now. So I would watch for that. That's right. I'll leave it there. I don't want to kind of I don't think we can sort of straight line and the administration has shown an ability to course correct when things have like really blown back in their face, right? So you look at what's happened in Minnesota. I know this is not the focus of this panel, but this thing became such an enormous liability that they're okay. So they're kind of pulling back on that. So I don't think we can straight line what's happening now with U.S.-Canada relations, with India. There is Canada and India and other countries. Yes, they angry with the U.S. They're looking at alternatives. I personally think that we pushed them too aggressively, and Canada in particular, and too hard. But I think that this is not, this is a dynamic state of affairs here, and I wouldn't say that, man, look, Trump is going to be a lame duck in by November, right? So you have to keep that in mind as well. This is not lasting forever, right?
Marco, if I may. Marco? Can I speak? Can I answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So I lived and taught in Canada for 6 years. So it's a country close to my heart and that I follow close. So let me say two things. One, the message, while not disagreeing with what Sassan is saying, obviously there's often, some retreat when pushback is found. But by and large, the sense that I get from what is happening in the White House, in the State Department, and so on, is that the Trump administration is winning and that they will go ahead with what they are doing. So that's number one. Number two, on Canada, it seems to me that Canada is an extraordinary example of what not to do when faced with Trump's pressures. Canada did something that should have never been done. In 2018, they arrested Meng Wanzhou, the vice president of Huawei and daughter of the founder and controller of Huawei, who found herself in a stopover in Vancouver airport and held her for 3 years on behalf of the United States on totally questionable legal grounds. The accusations against her were trade matters that did not constitute a criminal violation in Canada, and therefore Canada had no reason to keep her for 3 years under house arrest as they did. The result of that, which was the equivalent of, say, China arresting the daughter of Bill Gates in Shanghai for some technical reason, was that Canada worsened its relationship with China for that period of time. It gained no advantage from Trump, who proceeded to humiliate Canada once he got into its second term, called Governor Trudeau, Governor Carney. And there's a reason there. If you show weakness to Trump, he will proceed to humiliate. And so Canada ended up in the worst of both worlds, with very bad relations with Beijing and very bad relations with Washington. So there's a lesson there, it seems to me, to all those who want to see it. And it seems to me that Prime Minister Carney, in his by now famous Davos speech, hit the nail on the head on the way forward and what middle powers must do to be able to face the US policy that is now going after it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
So the title of the session includes the word sphere of influence, and I think we touched on that briefly when the mention of the John Rowe Doctrine appeared. And clearly the United States recently has made an effort to reassert a kind of sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, and we may think that NATO and Western Europe during the Cold War was a sphere of influence of sorts. So there's the intention of having a sphere of influence, and yet we see there are certain limitations to that, as we saw in Greenland. So the United States has some capability, but it can't operate just entirely as it wants in the Western Hemisphere. The question, though, is really to do with Russia and China. Russia has long had the intention of a sphere of influence in its near abroad. I don't know that it has the capability to do that, and it seems to be overstretched in Ukraine. If we think about Russia's presence in places like the South Caucasus, or even to some extent in Central Asia, Russia seems to be losing influence there. And what about China? Does China have the intention? Perhaps it has the capability, but does it have the intention of creating a sphere of influence? And to complicate this a little bit further, if I may, you talked about the West as being unified, which I think was, for the most part, true for the last, for the last 30 years, as we mentioned. I don't know that that's going to be true going forward. In fact, we're seeing increasingly there seems to be a rift between the United States and Europe. If we think about the controversy over Greenland, tariffs, so on and so forth. So what happens if Europe does reassert itself and rearm in the context of negotiations on the Russia-Ukraine war? Does Europe become another pole in this multipolar world, and then it becomes not just a triangular relationship, U.S., Russia, China, but does Europe play a more independent role, and then does it have a sphere of influence of its own?
Okay, I'll just start quickly. Europe, for sure, it already has a sphere of influence in all but name around itself, as long as many countries have still not given up on their dream to join the European Union, and it really helps. It's true. I mean, if you join the European Union, you get plenty of money just raining on you for infrastructure development, just increase your welfare, lift you up to some mid-range income level within the European Union, and you can benefit from it massively, especially if you have sound governance. And I mean, it's debatable whether Poland has sound governance, but Poland is one example of just massively benefiting from membership in the EU and being anchored in the Western sort of camp. So yeah, European. But my quick point is that the extent to which Europe will be able to wield power globally will depend on how the Ukraine war ends. So if Europe is capable of enforcing a just solution on and around and for Ukraine, I think that that is going to be a major boost to Europe's status. And especially if they preserve their transatlantic ties and if they manage to give contravention to US efforts, but in some form of collaboration, if say Donald Trump signs off on sort of Europe's plan or Europe's or solution proposed by. But for the time being, surely Europe needs to come together and get its act together and speak as one more or less, not just in pushing back against U.S. encroachments around Greenland, but most importantly in its relations with Russia and Ukraine and how they see Ukraine's future. And finally, does China want a sphere of influence? I think it does. It just is too smart. Beijing is smart enough not to call it sphere of influence, but for sure there's been discussion about China in Africa, China in Southeast Asia, and of course Taiwan is there. That is something that they call part of their homeland, not even sphere of influence. So in all but name, of course, China is building, a sphere where it can, say, influence government appointments or investment decisions or even security arrangements. Then, of course, Central Asia is one such term, although it's vast. And not so much is happening in Central Asia, but Beijing really wants that as a very stable year. And of course, Russia to conclude and to circle back to where we started. Of course, Russia is one partner country that Beijing wants to anchor in its whatever it is in its let's say sphere of influence. And so as my final point, I was now struggling with a term that could appropriately describe Russia China and how Russia is now falling under China's sort of purview. I would call them partners in the rear, or sort of rear partners, if I kind of allow me to kind of use this term. And what I mean by that is that China and Russia kind of come together to implement their secondary aspirations. They are important partners, but none of them are capable of giving the other party what they want first, right? So China first wants, Taiwan and apparently, more leeway in its trade relationships with the United States and South China Sea and so forth. Russia is unable to give that to China. Russia is able to poke the United States and Europe once and again, and maybe weaken them a little bit, distract them a little bit, but it does little to help China achieve its major strategic goals. And the same applies to Russia. Russia is longing for status, and China is unable to give Russia, the status, the international sort of recognition Russia wants. It only comes from the United States and to a small extent from Europe. So Russia is happy to jump at any opportunity to, do 12 trillion in business with the United States. Of course, that's a gross exaggeration, but getting back in sort of in friendship with the United States is such an attractive option for Russia that China comes second, which means that again, Russia and China are real partners. They are partnering on something which is secondary from the perspective of their core, of the core national interests of the incumbent regimes.
Michael, if I may?
Yes, of course.
Yes, on Europe, I must say I really don't see Europe emerging as a very significant pole asserting itself in world affairs in the near future. Yes, the question that was just put is quite right. In some ways, you can't talk about the West anymore as we did in the past as a geopolitical entity. The West has fractured, and there are very different views across the Atlantic. We've seen this in Davos, we've seen this at the Munich conference, very different views on what the West actually means. According to US view, the West embodies a Western civilization which is white, Christian, and committed to a number of things that in Europe are not shared at all. So, we are looking basically at the breakup of the West. That's the first point. The second point is that you might think this would lead Europe to reassert itself and, spending more on defense and so on. But it is not behaving in any stronger fashion. What we saw with Ursula von Leyen traveling to Mr. Trump's private golf course in Scotland to agree on a trade deal, which was totally unilateral in favor of the United States, was seen by many as unconditional surrender on the part of Europe to Trump's demands. Then, when it came to the question of the US attack on Venezuela, the bombing of Caracas, the kidnapping of President Maduro, some people expected that some European nations would speak out and say this is a violation of international law, a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. I watched the proceedings at the United Nations Security Council on that. And the way the United Kingdom and France spoke was humiliating. They basically attacked the Maduro regime and made only pro forma comments about the attack. And then a few weeks later, they found themselves at the other end of the stick, where the United States demanded the takeover of Greenland. Then suddenly Europe realized, well, the game is up. We must, get our bearings and actually react. And they did. But the way they got there was by showing weakness, not strength. So I wouldn't bet the farm on Europe becoming some sort of major pole in world affairs, quite the contrary.
Look, if I can add a couple of comments here. I agree with the skepticism on how quickly Europe can, whatever you want to call it, get its act together. And it really has to do with decision-making process and the structure of the European Union and it's really the lack of a common executive. And this has been a fundamental flaw of, a fundamental weakness of the structure, 27, 28 countries now, and you have qualified majority voting and, all this kind of stuff. But I really like the question because, I think when we look at the world, and I think if you look at economic power, that generally speaking, we see it as a bipolar world between, and I wouldn't say the West, I'd say the US and China. And if you want to if you look at it in a tripolar way, it's not Russia, but it's really the European Union. Again, I talked about the numbers and the 19 trillion and 30 from the US and 19 from China. So the combined firepower of Europe is strong, but it's fragmented, and it will probably continue to be for some time. Greenland, of course, and all this stuff has been a wake-up call. So now you have countries like, Germany and people who are very hesitant on things like having common bond issuance and things like that, or like getting more in line with that. So I do think that to some extent we should look at it that way. But the point that I would like to make on sort of Europe, taking the knee to the US and all this kind of stuff is that that's not as that the Europeans, on the face of tariffs, they sent delegations. Macron went to China, Sanchez went to China, Keir Starmer went to China. They're looking at some alternatives and they're looking to sort of balance themselves a little bit and between that. But that hasn't gone far because I read this narrative that the U.S. is going to push Europe into China's arms. The reason that's not happened is because they come back and they see that China is, again, you can't just ignore the economics here, that China is an economic threat to Europe. They're losing competitiveness to them, and this is a huge issue for them. And then they have, few ways to, they don't have many ways to address this. It's a real big problem. So they're sort of stuck in there. There's clearly still, I would say, a heavy lean towards the US in this relationship, although they have, tried to position themselves a little in between. They went there and they're saying like, look, this what's happening in the German auto industry with the Chinese vehicles and all that, it's really it's Europe hard. Maybe this is short termism and not long termism, but I think it's reality. Now, as far as Venezuela is concerned, I don't see why in the world the European Union would stand up and complain about the U.S. Taking out a rogue criminal regime that is Russia's back door into the Western Hemisphere. This is a U.S. business, and why I don't see why, other than that, oh, you want to push back against the U.S. just for the sake of it, why the European Union would have complained about this. The break rule of international law is I would, I don't think that's weakness from the European. I mean, yes, they're weak. They are weak vis-a-vis the U.S. on the economic front. Trump overplayed his hand significantly on Greenland. This has been a big wake-up call from the central bank heads to all the European Union. But ultimately, I don't think anybody's looking to rupture the relationship here. I think, yes, they're looking to rebuild it. They're looking to build the euro as a reserve currency. The Chinese, if you look at it in purely financial economic terms, there are three blocks in currency now. It's US, Europe, the euro, and China. And China and the Europeans are both trying to rival the US. And yes, China, and this wake-up call has been, we need to, they just opened up the ECB, European Central Bank, just opened up swap lines to the rest of the world. So this is a way of trying to leverage this very disparate economic power that they have. But I do agree with you, Jorge, that until there is a fundamental change in the structure of the executive in Europe, and this is where the internal fighting between France and Germany and this and that has been a real impediment, then I don't see it as being massively successful. But marginally, I think we improved it there.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then.
All right, thanks. George, I actually have a question for you, actually. You seem to look like, basically an entire argument based on anti-American, anti-Western narrative rather than the facts. So, in your view, actually, how could Chile do to counter China's expansion into Latin America, or otherwise, or do you really consider China some kind of benign power?
Sorry.
I mean, do you consider China?
I take objection to your preface.
Yeah.
I am arguing on the basis of fact, so I don't know how.
Yeah, I know.
You can,
My point is.
This is not your question.
Yeah, what Chile can
Okay.
do to counter China's expansion?
I would ask you to rephrase your question if you can.
Yeah. So, in your view, what Chile can do, or what Latin America can do to counter China's expansion of power to the Western Hemisphere?
Sure. I will say this. Chile is a classic example of how you can actually balance the relationship between the United States and China and do it very successfully. This is what Chile has done over the course of the past 50, 60 years. Let me give you an example. President Boric visited China in 2023 in late October, and had a state visit there, was received with a great palace of the people, then participated in the third BRI International Cooperation Forum. Chile is the only country in Latin America that has participated at the presidential level in all three BRI presidential forums. I was in the first one in 2017. And then, 10 days later, President Boric was received in the White House by President Biden to discuss a particular Latin American initiative by the United States. Not very many leaders from developing countries around the world can say that they are received and hosted at the Great Palace of the People one day and 10 days later in the White House. This is what me and my co-authors have called, Carlos Fortini and Carlos Rominami have called active non-alignment, which means you don't side with one of the great powers in competition, either the United States or China, but you actually put your own interests front and center. Now, on the specific question of how beneficial the relationship between Chile and China has been, Chile signed a free trade agreement with China in 2005. The first free trade agreement that China signed with an individual country anywhere in the world, not just in Latin America. I remember I followed those debates. There was a lot of criticism. People said this is the wrong thing. We will be inundated with Chinese trinkets. Chile will have a big trade deficit. Well, bilateral trade between China and Chile has increased eightfold since then, over the past 20 years. From $8 billion, it has now reached around $60 billion. And Chile actually runs a trade surplus. 40% of Chile's exports today go to China versus something like 16 or 17% of the United States. So, from that perspective, you could very well say that the relationship between China and Chile has been a win-win relationship, beneficial for both parties. Chile today is the most developed country in Latin America, according to a number of indicators, including HDI, by the Human Development Index developed by the United Nations. It is so in large part because Chile chose Asia as its preferred trading partner early in the 90s, not just China, but also India, Japan, ASEAN countries, and so on. And it has reached that level of development because it emphasized two things. One, free trade. Chile is the country that signed the most free trade agreements in the world, something like 30 trade agreements with 65 countries. And because it put its bets on the Asia Pacific as the most dynamic and fastest growing region in the world, and that of course includes China. Thank you.
So do you consider actually free trade with China countries some kind of costly?
Well, the argument has been made that there is a cost, and people have said that trading with China, one cost is that it contributes to deindustrialize your country in the sense that because Chinese imports are often so much cheaper than whatever you can produce at home, and on the other hand, because the incentives are to invest in commodities that China demands, those two things mean that countries, in Latin America in particular, will deindustrialize. As it happens, Chile doesn't have much of an industry anyway. Chile depends very much on mining, depends very much on agriculture. It's the biggest export of agricultural of fruit to China, was for a number of years. It's the biggest export of fruit in the southern hemisphere, and on services. So Chile doesn't have much of industry anyway. So you could argue that overall, that particular problem that has been faced by countries like Argentina or Brazil or Mexico hasn't affected Chile.
I like that follow-up question, and I'm certainly not an expert on Chile. I think Chile has done many things right. It's really a shining light in the Western Hemisphere as far as, on many different fronts. It's been a great economic success story. But I think that question kind of hit the nail on the head, that there is a cost that one should be cognizant of the cost, like having increased, and this is the problem with the US, right? So in classic, Adam Smith theory, of competitive advantage. You have competitive advantage here, you have competitive in manufacturing, you have it in natural resources. And so this is your terms of trade. And so everybody has aggregate wealth. This is kind of the right way to do this. What we have seen through history is that yes, this can work, but it from a strategic perspective, I would argue that it's China is a user and sucks commodities and natural resources from the rest of the world, and that's okay, that's fine, that's the way it is. But look what's happened. We bring it back to Russia, right? Russia has failed to diversify from being an petroleum state, and this is comes at really long-term costs. I look at my home country of Iran. It's the same thing. It's the curse of natural wealth, the Dutch syndrome, whatever you might want to call it. And so I think that question was spot on. I do think that Chile has done many great things. I completely sympathize with the notion of non-alignment but I think that countries need to be sensitive to the long-term plan here, and I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that in Europe now, where they had the manufacturing competitiveness on intermediate goods with China, and now that's disappeared. And maybe this is the trend, and maybe you can't completely stop it, but I think you should at least be cognizant of it. And this is where the whole notion of free trade versus fair trade, which is again what the Trump administration talks about, which is what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talks about. I do think I have some sympathy for that, and I think this is something that has been borne out in the data. That's why I started the whole conversation with WTO as being really sort of a turning point in the launch of China's economic power, which has helped fuel the military power and everything else that the sphere of influence and everything else that goes along with it.
Yes, Marco, can I add something?
Yeah.
Yes, sure. Well, in the economic literature, there is of course something called the resource curse. And by that is meant that, say, countries like Nigeria, like Venezuela, because they are so endowed with, oil in this particular case, they will not do the needful to actually develop, and they will not benefit from those resources. I would argue very strongly that Chile has 20% of the world's copper. It's the largest exporter and producer of copper in the world. It's the second largest exporter of lithium. It has some of the largest lithium deposits in the world. It's an exception to that rule. As I said earlier, Chile today is the most developed country in Latin America. This is not by happenstance. It is because it has managed its natural resources well. That's number one. And I take an exception to what Sassan has said about fair trade. What does fair trade mean? I mean, define fair trade to me. I realize President Trump is a great champion of fair trade. I'm not sure what it means. Chile believes in free trade. And we have signed free trade agreements with many countries around the world and have done very well, even being a small country at the end of the world. So, I think free trade and globalization has been a good thing for many countries around the world. And I would stand by that.
If I can, since you cited that, if I could just comment on this, I think since the war, since the post-war period, the U.S. was a very extremely wealthy country, and it was very much in the U.S. interest to bring up the rest of the world, and so when the U.S. we could afford to look the other way as India imposed 100% tariff on U.S. car imports, where U.S. to the extent that there's even any import has negligible, and I think it's really it's not reality to say that we've lived in a free trade era. If you actually look at effective tariff rates, the U.S. has had one of the lowest effective tariff rates, and the EU has been somewhat quietly protectionist, and the developing world has been extremely protectionist. And so, from the U.S. perspective, I'm not talking about Chile right now. From the U.S. perspective, this has been okay, fine up to a certain extent, but then you look at what's happened in the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector and all of these things that have come with it. It has accelerated that. Maybe that's inevitable. We have, white collar, smart people in the entire rest of the world. And we see this in technology, we see this, all that. But I would just push back on that, what we have labeled, globalization and free trade has been a good thing. And you look at it and then people scratch their heads and they say, why did Trump win Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and all of that? This has a lot to do with it. You have, these you sort of decimated a lot of the traditional industry. Can we bring it back? I don't know. It's going to be really hard. But anyway, I'll leave it there. So as you can see, I'm a little bit on the other side of your, I generally think globalization, it's been good. It's raised the standards of living of other countries and the people who have benefited from it. And the U.S. benefited from it in the early part because these were markets for us, and so this was good, and so we could sell things into these countries. But I think this thing has the balance of economic power has shifted there.
Sassan, if I may, per capita income in the US today is 86,000. You think that shows a failure? I think it shows a great success.
Well, I won't get into the distributional elements of that and all of that, and I think this is where it manifests. Again, this is the thing from the economic data, and you can look at this. It's been you have 3%, 4%, GDP growth, and you have people saying that they're not as well off, whatever, inflation and all these other things are the reasons. But it's distributionally destructive to some extent, and I think maybe people in economic theory you can retool and you can we can all learn to be computer programmers and all that. But in the meantime, you have a couple of generations that are hurt by that.
All right. I think we have one more question. Or are we at time? Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. That's time, I guess. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to the panelists for speaking and your work you added. There's an event later at 7 if anyone wants to come to that as well.
What is the event?
It's not minded, yeah. International institutions and global.
Okay.
So the
thank
Hollow
you.
World Order, please join us to have a discussion about whether international institutions are able to meet the moment we're in.
Thank you.